Hi guys, it's Sophie. So today I'm going to be doing a video talking about some books on politics that I want to recommend to you all. But before I get into that, I just want to say a couple things. Firstly, we're getting really close to the deadline for UK voters to register to vote. If any of you who are watching this, because I know I do have some people who are younger, if any of you haven't registered yet and are thinking, I'll do it, just do it. You can do it online, it only takes sort of 5-10 minutes. Pause this video now, go register to vote and then come back. I don't really care if you vote for a party that I wouldn't vote for, that doesn't really matter to me, but I really do care that people engage. So yeah, that's kind of one of my disclaimers, and the other disclaimer is going to be that I fall fairly hard on the left of the political spectrum, and that will be reflected in the books I'm going to talk about today. So those of you who have differing political opinions probably choose different books, but I'm guessing that you want to see what I would pick, seeing as you're watching my channel. So yeah, I have a few things I'm going to talk to you about, and I'm going to talk about why I've picked each of those books as well. So the first book that I'm going to recommend to you today is Chavs by Owen. The subtitle of that one is The Demonisation of the Working Class. And I think this is a good book to start on because whilst it obviously does have a leaning toward the left, this gives you a really good background on what has happened to the UK sort of from the beginning of sort of the Labour movement and in politics, and what the sort of on the ground reality has been for a lot of people, and I think that's quite grounding. It's very easy to think when you sort of first start to engage in politics that things have always been exactly the same as they are now, and that's not the reality, and this gives you just a little bit of background about that. The focus on this book is obviously on the working class and on sort of the way that the middle class and the upper class look down on the working class nowadays, and what impact that has, why that is, and what sort of damage that does. But yeah, I think interesting topic in terms of the book itself, talking about like the kind of phenomenon of chavs, but I think it's a good political grounder if you haven't sort of gone into a lot about British politics before, and especially Labour. And then the next one I have, I kind of want to pair with that last one because the topics are fairly similar, and this one is The Rise of the Right by Simon Winlow, Stephen Hall and James Treadwell. And I read this book really recently, and if you have watched my recent videos you'll know that I was really impressed with this one. This is again talking about specifically like the working class in the UK, and this one looks at the reasons why parties such as the English Defence League and UKIP have come into popularity, and the ways in which those parties are offering something to people who've become disenfranchised with the traditional left and traditional voting in general. So it talks about disengagement, it also talks about similar issues sort of facing working class communities that Chavs does, but it sees it from a lens that is potentially a little bit more cold, a little bit more scientific than Owen Jones is. The reason I think this one's really important is because you can see very clearly here where sort of nationalism has become mixed up with racism and xenophobia and sort of hate, and why I think often people on the left associate those two things together almost inextricably, and this kind of brings sense to that and allows you to see how potentially that is a misconception. But yeah, I think this one is a really interesting look on that kind of rise of UKIP, and particularly now we've seen recently UKIP's fall, and it's kind of been somewhat eaten up by the Conservatives. I think this is even more important to try and understand why that's happened, and why people who would have voted for the Labour Party historically and have been quite sort of traditionally Labour families have now shifted allegiances to vote Conservative. So really interesting. Again, like just getting into the psychology of voters as well. I thought this was fantastic. And then looking at the other side, we have something a little bit different, and this one is Radical by Maajid Nawaz, and this is actually talking about his journey into Islamic extremism. But the reason I wanted to include this one in here is the first section of this book, the first sort of period of this book, is talking about what the experience is like for young Muslims in the UK, and about the ways in which those individuals are treated, and the way in which the kind of mistrust and hate can be so damaging on both sides. And it's really interesting to see how those two matters tie into one another, and how these two things that we're kind of facing, that you often see, sort of terrorism and also like this seemingly like growing racism, how those two things stem from a very similar thing and how they affect people on both sides. So I found sort of thinking about the rise of the right and radical together actually really interesting for me. And the next one I have is another one that's a little bit different, but that one is This Is London by Ben Judah. And I read this one a little while ago now, but I spoke about it I think fairly recently. And what this book does is it focuses on the lives of people living in London that we normally don't consider when we think about the UK as a whole. And I think this is so interesting to see how the population of the UK is made up. And obviously this is focusing on London, but there are sort of similarities to be drawn across many urban centres sort of in the UK. And about the people who live in our cities and live and work and are really part of the fabric of England, who we don't really see and who we kind of don't really know exist. They aren't people who are focused on. So these are, you know, like low wage workers, cleaners, sometimes like migrant workers, sex workers, homeless people. I just thought this one was a really interesting way to like bring alive, I suppose, all of the different kind of experiences people have in this country. And I can't lie, a lot of this is really dark, a lot of this is quite upsetting. There's you know, like overcrowding in houses and people like sleeping in single beds and shifts and stuff. Like, it's not nice to read about, but it is a part of our country, and it's a part of our country I didn't know anything about really until I picked this one up. And the next one I have is on something a bit wider. Obviously the ones I've spoken about so far have been all around the sort of British politics, because that's what's going on at the moment. We're coming up to a general election, but this one is a little bit broader, and this one is Against Elections by David Ram Vrabuk. And this one's really interesting. This one is talking about the ways in which sort of voting has come about, the uses of voting in democracies and kind of the definition of democracy. It thinks that elections are intrinsically undemocratic, but it's a really interesting way to look and examine the way in which we give people power in our societies, and to also kind of query that. So it does talk about sort of a lot of ideas in antiquity, so going back to kind of the roots of democracy, but it draws it back to movements like Occupy, so bringing it into kind of the 21st century. But I find this one a really interesting book to, I guess, force me to look a little bit more about why we call democracy democracy, and what is democracy really. And again, it kind of talks a little bit about citizenship, which is something I've been thinking about more and more recently. So yeah, really interesting on that one. And the next one I have isn't one that's directly on politics, but I think it for me it is, but you might not see it and think it's a political book. And it's Justice by Micheal J. Sandel. And this is really just a book about kind of moral philosophy and about the ways in which people make moral decisions. And the reason why I want to include this in here is because that's kind of what I think politics should be about. And I think you should start with a moral basis, i.e. what is acceptable to us and what kind of society do we want to have, and then the nitty-gritty of it that tends to be most of politics should be formed around that idea of what you want to be able to provide. Now, I know the world isn't a perfect place, and I'm not saying that you should be able to make this grand utopia, but I do think that it's rare that we have a moment in politics where we look back and look at sort of the moral implications for a whole society, which for me is kind of what we ought to be doing. So Justice is a fantastic book. It's a really good introduction to sort of moral philosophy. I'm planning on reading a lot more on this kind of topic soon, so yeah, Justice is one I really enjoyed. And then the very last book I want to show you is a tiny, tiny little book, and this one is England, Your England by George Orwell. It really is very small indeed. And back to Britain just for the end of this video. This is an essay by George Orwell talking about England and why England is great and what problems England has and who we are as a country and what we should want to be, what our politicians do, what shouldn't they do, and what kind of a person are you in our society. And he pairs off throughout this essay the idea of Britain as this kind of militaristic, sort of warlike nation, the imperialist element of us, and this self-flagellating intellectual. So the pairing of these two kind of personalities, this odd split personality that the UK has, where we simultaneously want to kind of rule the world and also want our privacy and sort of to be judged only by our thought. And it's just a really interesting essay. It's a really intimate essay, I think, about the UK, and there are sections in here that could not be any more English. yeah, I think this is a good one to kind of finish up with. Whilst I know obviously it's a UK election, it's not just England, I do think it's good to go back and touch some stuff, you know, that is older and just kind of touchstone, I guess, for your politics and for where the country's come from. But yeah, I hope that video has been interesting, and I really hope that you're all looking forward to voting and actually sort of engaging in the elections. Remember, it's not about like, it's not always about seeing your party like win the general election. My party won't win the general election as much as I'd want them to. I know they won't, but that's okay. I always get really excited just to be able to have the chance to go out and exercise my right, and I think it's such an exciting thing to be able to do. It's such a great thing to be able to do in our society, and I think it's such a great opportunity as well to have your say. And it's rare that you get to have a say, like as an individual, on what affects you. So yeah, I hope those books have been interesting. Hopefully, you know, there's something there that might be interesting to other people. I know it's been very England, UK focused, this video. But yeah, hopefully that's been of some interest. Maybe some of you are interested in international politics, even if you aren't from the UK. But yeah, I'll see you soon in my next video, and hopefully some of you have gone away and registered to vote. See you soon. Bye bye.